So King Charles removed Camilla from hosting the garden party, and the weirdest part isn't even that he did it, it's that the palace had contingency plans drawn up before she even knew she was being sidelined. Like, before the confrontation even happened, before the private luncheon where she snapped, there were already documents sitting in a file outlining exactly how to reduce her role. That means someone in that building saw this coming weeks ago, and honestly, the fact that those papers existed before anyone told Camilla is probably more revealing than the removal itself. Before we get into how this all unraveled, real quick, if you want more royal deep dives like this one, hit subscribe to Crown Watch. We break down the stuff that happens between the official statements. Okay, let's get into it. Charles was sitting alone at his desk, staring at the hosting list like it had gotten heavier than the crown itself. His hand moved once, then stopped. The garden party, this is one of those royal events where the monarch welcomes invited guests into the palace grounds to show public warmth and continuity, had been planned as this big display of unity. Camilla was supposed to be right there beside him, smiling through the ceremony, greeting guests, basically proving to everyone that nothing inside the palace had cracked. And hosting isn't just about handshakes, it shows who holds trust, who carries visibility, who stands closest to the king. That's why the order of who greets which guests matters so much. It's a public map of importance, and everyone watching knows how to read it. Charles lowered his eyes to her name. For several seconds, he didn't speak, then he drew the line. He removed Camilla from garden party hosting duties and reassigned the role to another senior royal figure. And under royal protocol, those rules that decide order, rank, and ceremonial behavior, this change carried way more weight than just a schedule adjustment. This wasn't a late tweak to the program. This was a boundary. This was the king saying the day could not become a stage for tension, pride, or influence. Camilla got the news in a private sitting room, and her expression changed before her voice did. She held herself still, but it was a wounded kind of stillness. When the aide finished explaining, she only asked one question. Was this his decision? The aide answered carefully, saying the change was tied to tone, optics, and control inside the palace. Camilla understood every single word. Tone meant how the event would feel. Optics meant how the public would read it. Control meant Charles no longer trusted the arrangement. The closed door changed everything. Charles hadn't removed her to fill a gap. He had made a royal correction. And everyone close enough to feel the shock knew it. But here's where it gets deeper. The true shock wasn't that Camilla had been removed. It was who Charles was trying to protect when he made the decision, because every royal decision has two versions, the one written on paper and the one carried in the faces of the people who have to live with it. For Charles, this wasn't just a hosting change. For Camilla, it wasn't just a public duty lost. For William, it was a warning. And inside the palace, everyone understood that one garden party had exposed a much deeper wound. Charles knew that calm was sometimes more dangerous than anger. He'd spent his whole life learning how to speak softly when the room was breaking apart. And now that lesson stood between him and the woman seated across from him. The garden party was supposed to be simple to the outside world, a graceful royal gathering where invited guests met the family in the palace grounds. But inside the monarchy, it meant far more. It was a public signal of trust, rank, and belonging. Whoever stood at the center wasn't just greeting guests, they were being shown as part of the institution's beating heart, and Camilla understood that too well. She had treated those hosting duties as proof that the long road of rejection, judgment, and whispered resistance had finally ended. To stand beside Charles was to be seen, accepted, and protected. So when he told her the arrangement had changed, the wound landed deeper than the words themselves. Charles didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse her. He spoke carefully, almost gently, and that restraint hurt more than fury would have. Camilla sat rigidly, her face controlled, but the pain showed in the silence between each breath. Charles tried to explain that the decision was about protecting the day, protecting the guests, and protecting the crown from a public display of private tension. But Camilla heard something colder beneath it. She heard distance. She heard doubt. She heard the king choosing the palace over her pride. And when William entered, later guarded and quiet, the air changed again. The prince didn't celebrate the decision. He didn't push it further, but he sensed what his father had already accepted, that this removal could stop one public problem while opening a far more personal fracture. William saw the sealed palace note before Camilla did. The document showed the hosting order had been reviewed more than once, long before the public schedule was complete. That meant the removal hadn't been born in panic. It had been discussed, considered, approved. Camilla realized then that while she had believed the role was secure, others had already questioned it behind closed doors. Charles watched that realization settle over her, and the room seemed to narrow around them. The decision had been made, the damage had begun, but the question burning underneath every controlled expression was why Charles finally acted now after years of allowing Camilla to stand at his side. And that answer didn't lie in the garden party itself. It lay in a private moment days earlier that turned quiet tension into royal consequence. The palace remembers certain moments not because they're loud, but because no one forgets what happened after them. Days Before the garden party decision, a private luncheon became the trigger everyone later traced back to the beginning. A sentence was spoken, a chair scraped against the floor, one face hardened, and from that instant, Charles knew the next public event couldn't continue as planned. Charles entered that luncheon believing the final details could still be handled with grace. The gathering had been arranged inside the palace breakfast room to settle the order of greetings before the garden party, and every person present understood the weight of that order. Guest reception meant the planned sequence of which royal figure would welcome which group first, from foreign guests to charity leaders to military families. It sounds simple, it's not. In royal life, sequence becomes status, and status becomes power. Charles knew the wrong placement could turn a polite afternoon into a silent declaration of who mattered most. Camilla noticed Catherine's position before anyone explained it. For one segment of the event, Catherine had been placed ahead of her in the receiving order, and the change cut through the table like a warning. Camilla didn't immediately explode. She questioned it with a tight calm that made the room more uneasy than anger would have done. Charles watched her tone sharpen, and he felt the old fear rise again, not fear of scandal alone, but fear that private tension was beginning to demand a public stage. William spoke carefully, almost softly, asking that the order remain unchanged for the sake of the day. The prince understood that Catherine's role wasn't an insult to Camilla. It was a signal of continuity, a way to steady the future before thousands of eyes could study every movement. Camilla heard something else. She heard displacement. She heard a younger figure being lifted while she was being asked to accept less. Then she set down her teacup with such force that conversation died instantly. No one needed to name the fracture. Everyone felt it. Charles looked from Camilla to William, and the silence became unbearable. Then she said the sentence that changed everything. Then perhaps the public should know who was really hosting this family. The words weren't shouted, but they carried the danger of a match struck near dry paper. Charles understood at once that the garden party could no longer be trusted to remain ceremonial. It could become a confrontation dressed in smiles. Charles ended the luncheon without drama, but the damage had already entered the walls. After the others left, he asked the aides to step out and stayed alone with a hosting folder for nearly 10 minutes. When he finally called his private secretary back in, his choice had hardened. That luncheon became the point of no return. But the real confrontation came when Camilla learned that Charles had acted on what he heard. And when the door finally closed behind them, husband and wife were no longer discussing a garden party, they were confronting the limits of power. There are words a monarch can say in public, and words a husband can barely say in private. Charles had spent a lifetime mastering restraint, but in that room, restraint became a blade. Camilla came looking for reassurance. Instead, she found a decision already made, a file already signed, and a man who would not retreat from the most painful sentence of the day. Charles didn't rise when Camilla entered. That alone told her more than any speech could have done. He remained behind the desk, tired in a way that no crown could hide, with the revised garden party hosting sheet placed between them like evidence. A palace study isn't just a private office. It's the kind of room where royal decisions are shaped before they become public reality. And this decision had already crossed that line. Her role had been reassigned. The order had been approved. The gathering that once promised to confirm her place had become the setting of her removal. Camilla stood still for a moment as if refusing to accept the meaning of the paper before her. Then anger found her voice. She asked whether this was punishment, whether one sharp sentence at a luncheon had become enough to erase her from the center of a royal event. Charles looked at her with the exhaustion of a man who knew every answer would wound someone. He told her he wasn't punishing her. He was protecting the monarchy from becoming a family argument in public. The words were measured, but they landed hard because Camilla understood what they meant. He believed the danger was real. Camilla's anger didn't disappear. It cracked. Beneath it came sadness, quiet and heavy. She had expected reassurance, maybe even an apology. Instead, Charles wasn't asking for permission. He was telling her what would happen. The hosting plan, the official arrangement deciding which royals greet which guests and in what order, had already been changed. And that matters because royal order is never just order. It tells the public who carries trust, who carries influence, and who must step back when the institution demands it. Charles finally revealed the warning that had pushed him further than Camilla expected. Several senior figures had told him the garden party could become a visible power struggle if the original plan remained unchanged. They feared tension would slip through the smiles, that guests would sense division, that cameras would catch what the palace tried to bury. Camilla listened, wounded not only by the decision, but by the fact that others had discussed her place before she'd been allowed to defend it. Then Camilla asked a question both of them had been avoiding. Had William influenced him? Charles paused. He didn't give her a clean denial. He didn't offer the comfort she wanted. The silence stretched long enough to become its own confession. And in that silence, Camilla realized the decision was bigger than one garden party, bigger than one wounded pride, bigger even than Charles's refusal. Behind it stood a deeper question of who truly controlled royal presentation. Power inside the palace rarely announces itself. It moves through calendars, seating charts, reception lines, and names placed higher or lower on a page. To the public, hosting a garden party may look graceful and simple, but behind the gates, the order of greeting reveals hierarchy, trust, and warning. And this time, the paper trail pointed to something Camilla hadn't expected. Charles knew the decision wouldn't remain hidden in ink. Once his name settled on the final approval, the change became more than a private wish. It became royal instruction. The garden party hosting plan was controlled through royal secretaries, household officials, security advisors, and the king's final sign-off. Those roles matter because a palace event doesn't run on charm alone. Every greeting line, every arrival time, every assigned duty carries a message. Camilla had believed that message still placed her close to the center. The revised order told a different story. Charles reviewed the list with a stillness that made the senior courtier beside him uneasy. The courtier had served long enough to know when silence meant pain, and he watched the king's hand slow over Camilla's name before the pen moved. The hesitation mattered. It showed this wasn't a cold act, it was a costly one. Charles wasn't simply changing his schedule, he was placing the crown's public shape above the comfort of his own household, and that choice gave the paper its force. Garden party hosting was part of the crown's public choreography, the planned order through which the monarchy presents unity, rank, and trust to the people watching. William understood that choreography with sharp clarity. In a quiet corridor conversation, the prince spoke to an aide with controlled care, insisting that they had to remain dignified, not divided. He didn't want triumph. He wanted control. He knew Camilla's reduced role would be studied by everyone who understands royal signals, and he also knew one wrong gesture could turn discipline into humiliation. But the future king didn't step away from the reality. The event had to serve the monarchy before it served anyone's pride. Camilla's removal reached deeper than the first announcement suggested. The revised hosting order limited which guests she could formally receive, cutting down her ceremonial visibility and narrowing the space where she could appear as a central figure. Then a second document surfaced inside the working file. It laid out contingency arrangements prepared in advance, proving the palace had expected resistance before Camilla ever challenged the decision. Let me pause on that for a second, because that detail is actually wild. They didn't just react to the luncheon, they had backup plans sitting in a folder, ready to go, before she even knew there was a problem. That's not crisis management. That's premeditated restructuring. Charles saw the final structure and understood the danger. Documents could command staff, they could shift names, they could control movement, but they couldn't control wounded pride once the news began passing from office to office, from aide to aide, from whisper to silence. By the time the revised instructions reached the staff corridors, the palace was no longer preparing for a party, it was preparing for fallout. The first sign of collapse wasn't a public statement, it was a closed door. Camilla withdrew from the corridor with her face composed, but those who saw her noticed the change immediately. The woman who had expected to greet guests beneath palace trees was suddenly being asked to stand aside. And in royal life, standing aside can feel more brutal than being sent away. Camilla walked away from Charles with the kind of control that only made the wound clearer. She didn't argue in the corridor. She didn't demand another audience. She simply moved behind the nearest door and let the silence swallow what pride refused to show. The revised hosting instructions had already begun moving through the palace, changing arrival times, guest reception positions, and the duties assigned to senior royals. Those instructions mattered because a garden party is never just a pleasant afternoon. It's a public map of importance, and Camilla had just been moved away from the center of that map. Staff members received the update with careful faces and even quieter voices. They were told to treat the change as final, not temporary, and to avoid discussing it beyond necessary protocol. Protocol means the strict working rules that keep royal events controlled, from who stands where to who speaks first. But rules couldn't soften the meeting. Camilla's role hadn't been delayed, it had been reduced. The palace wasn't leaving room for negotiation, and that alone told every aide that Charles had crossed an emotional line he couldn't easily uncross. Camilla sat alone after leaving him, removing her gloves slowly and placing them on a side table as if accepting the humiliation piece by piece. The queen consort had survived years of judgment, but this felt different. This came from inside the walls. This came from the man whose approval had once shielded her from the coldest parts of royal life. Her sadness didn't arrive loudly, it settled heavily because she understood that public grace often demands private pain. Charles remained in his study after the conversation, staring at the closed door long after she had gone. The king was torn between personal loyalty and royal discipline, and neither side offered comfort. He had protected the event but wounded the person closest to him. Then the next discovery hardened the palace mood. Aides found that Camilla's name had also been removed from a short internal briefing prepared for garden party photographers and guest marshals. The staff who guide guests and manage the flow of the day Charles understood what that meant. The palace didn't only want her role reduced, it wanted no confusion over who would visibly lead the event. But the emotional weight of the decision didn't fully land until Charles and William spoke without advisors, titles, or protection. What followed wasn't a meeting of monarch and heir, it was a private reckoning between father and son. When Charles and William finally stood alone, the palace machinery disappeared. No aides, no polished phrases, no formal witness to the truth, only a father who had made a painful decision and a son who understood why it had become unavoidable. In that private room, the garden party stopped being the issue. The real subject was the future of the crown itself. Charles called William in after the revised hosting order had been completed, and that invitation carried a weight both men understood. This wasn't another official briefing. A hosting order means the approved plan deciding which royal figure would greet which guests and in what position during a public palace event. But for Charles, the paper had become something far more personal. It had forced him to choose between the peace of his own marriage and the public stability of the monarchy. William entered quietly, not as a challenger, but as a son who knew the cost of what his father had just done. Charles didn't pretend the choice had been easy. He admitted he had waited too long to correct the tension, too long to believe that silence could manage what pride had already sharpened. The king knew Camilla would feel wounded, and that mattered because her place beside him had always been more than ceremonial. It had been proof of survival, proof that years of rejection had finally given way to acceptance. Removing her from the center of the garden party didn't only change the schedule, it struck at the meaning she had built around that role. William listened with careful restraint. The prince didn't look pleased. He didn't treat Camilla's removal as a victory. Instead, he answered with the quiet force of someone who had watched the pressure build for years. Correction, he told Charles, only felt this painful because the silence had lasted too long. The words landed hard, but they weren't cruel. They were true. William understood that public duties sometimes demanded a private wound, but he also knew wounds inside a royal family rarely stayed hidden forever. Charles then revealed the fear that had driven him. He believed the garden party could become a public symbol of competing influence. If he allowed the original plan to stand, guests would notice, staff would sense it, the palace would smile, but the fracture would breathe underneath every greeting. William promised he wouldn't exploit the decision because the monarchy couldn't survive if private victories became public trophies. Charles looked at his son and saw not triumph, but restraint. That changed the emotional direction of the day, but outside the palace walls, the silence was already breaking and the world was preparing its own judgment. And when the story reached the public, one image captured the meaning of the decision more sharply than any official explanation could. By morning, the palace no longer owned the story. The public did. What began as a private hosting decision became a national spectacle, stripped of soft language and placed beneath unforgiving headlines. People didn't simply ask why Camilla had been removed. They studied every photograph, every absence, every rearranged position, and one front page turned palace silence into public verdict. Charles had wanted control, but control vanished the moment the first broadcast opened with his decision. The palace response was brief, careful, and cold, describing the garden party arrangements as a reflection of the king's wishes and the ceremonial needs of the event. That phrase mattered because ceremonial needs means the public-facing duties that keep royal events orderly, dignified, and loyal to the crown's image. But the explanation didn't calm the storm, it sharpened it. Viewers understood that when the palace uses clean language, it usually means something far messier happened behind closed doors. Camilla watched the coverage from a private room, and every word seemed to remove her all over again. The screen showed older moments where she had hosted with confidence, standing beside Charles as if her place had finally become unquestioned. Then the story cut back to the new arrangement and the contrast was merciless. Camilla turned away before the segment ended. She had endured public judgment before, but this was different. This wasn't a scandal from the outside. This was the palace itself changing her position, then asking her to endure the meeting in silence. Charles watched another news segment without speaking. His jaw tightened as broadcasters framed the decision as a rare visible correction inside the royal household, focusing on his authority and Camilla's sudden absence from the hosting center. He knew the truth was more painful than the coverage allowed. He had acted to prevent public embarrassment, yet the attempt to stop one wound had opened another. The king had protected the event, but he had exposed the fracture. Then came the image that sealed the public mood. A major newspaper front page showed a wide palace garden photograph with an empty marked space beside Charles under the headline, "The King Hosts Alone." The words landed like judgment. Outside Buckingham Palace gates, a crowd gathered, not wild, not chaotic, but watchful. Visitors pointed at the front page, speaking in low voices about what Camilla's absence meant, and whether this was a correction, a warning, or a quiet fall from favor. Charles understood that headlines could explain nothing fully. Camilla understood they could still wound deeply. Public reaction couldn't define the final meaning of the moment. That judgment belonged to what he chose, what she lost, and what the monarchy gained. When the noise faded, The true verdict wasn't written in headlines. It was written in the emotional cost paid behind palace walls. In the end, this wasn't only about a garden party. It was about the moment King Charles accepted that love, loyalty, and royal duty don't always move in the same direction. Camilla lost a role she believed confirmed her place. Charles lost the comfort of avoiding confrontation. William saw the monarchy choose discipline, and the crown revealed what it protects first. Charles stepped into the day with a calm face and a heavy heart. He knew every greeting would be watched, every pause examined, every absence measured against the story already burning outside the gates. The garden party continued under the revised hosting order, the approved plan deciding which royal figure receives guests and where each person stands during the event. That order mattered because royal life speaks through placement. Camilla no longer led the ceremonial welcome, and the king carried that decision in public. Smile after smile, knowing the private pain behind it hadn't faded. Camilla remained dignified, but dignity didn't erase the wound. She understood now that her removal wasn't a passing embarrassment or a temporary adjustment. It was a boundary drawn by Charles himself. The palace presented calm on the surface, but the altered arrangement made the message unmistakable. Royal duty had been placed above personal expectation. For Camilla, that truth was harder than any headline. She had believed proximity to the throne meant protection. Instead, she learned that standing close to power isn't the same as controlling it. Charles didn't remove her to humiliate her. That was the final emotional revelation, and it cut deeper because it carried no cruelty. He removed her because allowing the tension to continue would have weakened the monarchy in public. The crown, meaning the institution of royal authority that survives beyond any one person, demanded order before comfort. Charles had avoided confrontation for as long as he could, but the garden party forced him to choose. He chose the institution. He chose the shape of the monarchy over the ease of his own household. William's quiet presence made the shift impossible to miss. The prince didn't need victory, and he didn't seek applause. His restraint showed what the future would demand: control, discipline, and refusal to let private conflict command public duty. William saw that the monarchy could survive pain, but not confusion. Charles saw it too, even as the cost settled heavily between him and Camilla. The verdict was clear. Charles chose duty over comfort. Camilla learned that acceptance doesn't equal authority. William watched the crown protect itself with painful precision. The monarchy survived the day by sacrificing ease for order. The garden party ended, the gates closed, and the verdict remained unmistakable. The crown had spoken, and even those closest to it had to obey.